All right, here we go again. Now we're talking about developmental psychology. And one of the things I want to warn you about this particular lecture is that normally when I give you a lecture, it's a half hour or so introduction to your readings, upcoming readings, like the chapters that you're going to read. But the difference about developmental psychology is that I'm actually covering stuff that Chafee offers whole courses on. So we're doing one lecture on something that's offered that we can cover in a whole semester. So there are two courses that talk about developmental psychology. That's lifespan psychology and child and adolescent development. So one of the things that you're going to get in this lecture is I'm going to possibly move through more quickly and not talk about everything that's on the slide so that I can keep it to half an hour. And I'm encouraging you to download the slides, read through some of the things that I have in it, and also you might be so interested in it that you want to take another course. Okay? So first of all, developmental psychology is really about psychology of people at different ages. It's age-related behavior and mental processes. So a 2-year-old acts differently than a 7-year-old, and they act differently than a 17-year-old, and they act differently than a 97-year-old who acts differently than a 47-year-old, right? So this developmental psychology is looking at all of these things. I am personally a developmental psychologist. It has captured my interest, and it is one of the fields of psychology that really thinks about cause and effect because we're studying things over time. We're studying how people change. So we're really thinking about, well, what leads to what? And that's especially interesting to me. As you know from your early reading in the introduction, there are some great debates in psychology, and those relate to nature versus nurture. Which is more important, our genes that we're born with or the environment and our influences that surround us as we grow up? That's a great debate. That debate has essentially been resolved to say it's both. Both of them interact. Another great debate in development psychology is stages versus continuity, meaning do we develop in sort of fits and starts, like we're in one stage and then boom, we're in another stage and we change completely? Or is our development gradual and continuous with one small thing building on another small thing? That debate is still in play. There's also the debate about or questions about stability versus change. What part of us stays the same over the course of our entire lifespan? And how much do we actually change? So these are fascinating questions that we get into the question of stability when we study personality, which we're going to do next lecture. Um, and let's move on. In this concept of like stages, one of the major ideas, stages versus continuity, one of the major ideas is this idea of critical periods. That there are periods in life when if you don't get it done during that time, you ain't going to get it done. And one of those critical periods, I have a good example, is has to do with language development. So from 0 to 5 years old, that's kind of the chance that kids have to actually develop brain receptors, perception receptors for certain sounds in language. And my example, you have a picture of me and my husband. My husband was born in India, so he can't for the life of him distinguish between the sound of V and W. So V and W. Like he can make the noises just fine, but hearing it, he can't hear it. So it's fascinating. I can't distinguish between the sound of I can't even make the sound. It's like duh and duh. Like one has an H in it, like it's breathed out. So that's the difference between saying dosa and dosa, which is like old man versus a nice tasty pancake roll. Anyway, that's critical periods. If you don't learn it between age and, by age 5, you probably can't distinguish that sound for the rest of your life. Another concept that's related to like nature, like what we're born with, is this idea of imprinting. So, imprinting is the process by which attachments are formed. Essentially, I'm going to ask you to watch this cute little video about geese, ducklings, goslings. Basically, they follow the first thing that they see when they hatch out of the egg. And it was Konrad Lorenz who discovered this. I believe he actually won a Nobel Prize for this observation. But a baby goose will follow the first thing that it moves, whether it's the mother goose, the human, or a lawnmower. And so that level of behavior wasn't learned. No one taught that baby goose to act that way. That baby goose just gravitated to the first thing that moved. And so that's an example of nature influencing the development of a baby goose. So for the next year, it's going to follow that human or that lawnmower or that mother goose. There are two primary ways of studying age-related psychology. One is cross-sectional design and one is longitudinal design. So I'm going to give you some slides that illustrate this. Oops. Cross-sectional design is measured all at one time. It's about, you take the measurement of a whole bunch of people that are differently aged, and you take that measurement all at once, and then you see, are old people different than middle-aged people, different than young adults, right? Are toddlers different than school-age children? So you basically compare the ages after you collect all the data all at once. That's cross-sectional. The other way is longitudinal. It goes for a long time. That's where you measure the same people. They're all, well, they don't have to do that. Anyway, you measure the same people multiple times as time passes. So it's measured again and again and again. So that way you could see if the same people at 2 years old are different when they're 7 years old. And so that helps to, the reason why that is important is because it helps to control for or account for this other idea, which is an issue, which is the cohort effect. Now, I want you to know this word. It's a nice concept. It's the idea that people who are born at a specific time are subject to historical influences or cultural influences that actually influence how they behavior. One example would be the Great Depression. If you came of age when your family was starving and all of your neighbors were starving, you're going to have a different idea about saving string and wasting food than someone who came of age when there was plenty of food to go around and more or less enough money. Or, now here's an example I have laid out for you. So here I have Trump and Biden. They're both over 70. They probably went to college and had to use typewriters to type their papers, if they even did their homework. So they probably barely even know how to Google or how to optimize some of the technology because they came of age at an earlier time, so they're considered non-digital natives. They're not native to a digital world. Now here you have LeBron James and Scarlett Johansson. They're both 35 years old right now. And I have this image of an old Apple laptop. So they probably did their homework on a laptop, which was awesome because I'm 55, so I remember I did mine on a MacBook. Anyway, so they probably they're probably more likely to call you if they want to talk to you than text you because maybe they sent emails or maybe they use phones, but they share a commonality of experience in terms of how they came of age. Now you hear, what's her name? Oh, I forgot. Anyway, but that's Timothy Chalamet. They came of age when everybody had a smartphone and social media was on your smartphone. So you were only this feet away from telling whether or not someone liked your post. That means that both of these people here, these young folks at 24, are likely to be very, very sensitive to whether someone likes their post or not. And that's probably going to impact their identity and how they feel about themselves. as for me, I don't give a hoot whether I give a little hoot whether anyone likes my post or not. But that's not how I go about finding my self-worth. I do it otherwise. But my son, he's a little bit subject to the fact that whether people like his post or not, it can really bring him down. But that's something we can't relate to because of different cohort effects, right? There's also really interesting stuff in the chapter about behavioral genetics and epigenetics, and it's probably more than I can get into. But the difference is that like, for example, imprinting is a behavioral genetic. It for the geese anyway, they're running around following a lawnmower. um, that's behavior that's built into their genes. We may have behavior that's built into our genes. For example, we talked about some of our emotional reactions could be considered, like, for example, if you reject me socially, I'm going to hang my head. That's kind of one of those universals, right? Like, nobody taught me to hang my head in regret and sorrow for the thing that I said that made you reject me. But that's one of those things that our behavior is sort of built into our genes in some cases. Epigenetics is the idea that your actual DNA, your genetic instructions that's in your body, changes over the course of your lifetime. So you can have genes that turn on and turn off based on your life experiences. Maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people thought if it's in your DNA, then you're genetically predisposed to be that way. You were born that way. Now people, and that was sort of how people felt about themselves when they were depressed. They had to think, oh, it's in my genes, so I guess I was born to be depressed. But actually, they're finding that environmental influences can actually influence how your physical DNA expresses itself. That's the difference between those two things. Physical development. I'm not even going to talk about milestones of infant motor development. I'd like you to know that people track these milestones. Milestones are very important in understanding whether the child is developing correctly, but I'm going to let you read about it and take another class if you want to think about it more. And here's a video that you can watch starting at minute 1 that will give you more to think about in terms of infant milestones. I do want to talk about brain changes in childhood and adolescence, because if you don't take another class, I want you to know that the brain itself changes in really significant ways in childhood and adolescence. Some of those are the connections that your synapses makes, and the dendrite connections become more elaborate. So here you see at birth, there's hardly any connections between these neurons. Now at 3 months, it's really growing. At 15 months, oh my goodness, growing even more. At 6 years, wow, that's a tangled mess of possible connections between this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing. But look at what happens at 14 years. The connections actually start to prune. And what happens is connections that you sort of made when you were young, if you're not using them as you age, that's called synaptic pruning. It pairs itself away. At the same time, the neural connections that you are using, they get myelinated. That's like they get extra insulation, which means they work better, they work faster, they're more automatic. Myelinated. So what's happening as you grow is you have all of these possible connections, and then it's kind of like democracy, right? Like the use of a neural connection is like a vote. The more you use it, the more it speeds up. The less you use it, the more likely it's going to go out of business. Okay, here's an awesome. I love this guy. He does like a lot of the sort of AP. If you're studying for AP psychology, you can watch his videos and learn a heck of a lot. But this is about the teenage brain. I recommend this video. It will help you understand differences in the teenage brain. Rather than, again, this might be a topic to really focus on if you take one of these other developmental classes, and I'm going to leave it to you to look at it, but I want you to understand What I think is most beautiful about the teenage brain is this process of use it or lose it. That the teenage brain does so much pruning, get rid of that, so much optimizing, that to me it's one of the most beautiful indicators of how human beings are adaptable. So, an Eskimo, right, that's born to understand how snow works versus a Hawaiian that's born to understand how waves work, ocean waves work, they're going to really teenage what happens to the teenage brain is it starts to save only those connections that are particularly useful in its environment. So a child that's born in times of war is going to potentially have a brain that is physically geared toward prioritizing safety, the safety concerns, right? And you can, so think about that. It's a beautiful part of what makes us human, I think, in terms of how we can adapt to different situations. Another age group that maybe you've never heard of, you've heard of adolescence, you've heard of childhood, but maybe you've never heard of emerging adulthood. That is an age period when you're not quite adult and you're not quite an adolescent. You're sort of semi-independent. So it's a time when you tend to be exploring yourself. You don't have a stable identity necessarily. You're often very focused on who you are and what you can do for the world and what you want to get from the world and what you want to give to the world. There's a feeling of in between, and often it's a feeling that possibilities are still open to you. Let me tell you, I felt that possibilities were still open to me up until maybe late 40s. And no, well, I entered grad school thinking that possibilities were still open to me. Unfortunately, they still are. But I can tell you, after 50, you start to think, yeah, I got to make do with what I've got right now. I got to make the most of what I have instead of like new things are going to be coming at me. But one of the things about emerging adulthood is not every culture really even has this phase. Some people at age 18 are wham, bam, or maybe 16 even. They're boom, right into adulthood. Um, but it's an interesting thing to actually use this idea to compare cultural practices, even within the United States. Like different cultures are going to say, nurture people at age 18 to 24 in a different way than another culture can. So it's good to understand what your culture does. Now I'm going to zoom physical changes in an adulthood. We know about our graying hair. We know about our wrinkles. We know about our weight gain. We know about sometimes we actually lose height as we age. Not sometimes, we do. People lose height. A woman's going to go through menopause, and we're all going to lose some muscle mass. But one thing to realize is that this idea of midlife crisis is a myth. There was this idea that if you're like middle-aged men are gonna buy not a hotel, buy a Corvette and drive around in a sports car and try to get a younger wife. And that might be more of an artifact of the 1970s and the way the culture was at that time than it is about something real that all people go through. Most people don't have a specific identifiable midlife crisis. What about issues associated with work or job loss? Parenthood. If you become a parent, doesn't that change your development? I say, oh, heck yeah. And probably those of you who are listening that are parents, you're like, yeah, almost nothing else has changed me as much as becoming a parent. Or what about engaging in military service or taking care of your parents? What does that do to your identity? What does it do to your feelings? Or divorce or migration if you move from one country to another? Like these are huge issues that have massive impacts on how a person develops. But these aren't necessarily considered developmental milestones. They're really considered context, very, very important contexts of development, which I want to highlight to you. And we can talk about more if you take this more classes about it, that these contexts of that you develop in have huge impacts on who you become. Okay, that's all we'll say about that. Brain changes in late adulthood. We know that it's expected that our cognition will decline, but it is not inevitable, meaning you don't have to experience huge declines in cognitive ability. Most older adults experience some slowing, but at the same time, the sense of knowledge accumulation, that's something. What do I have here? Speed of processing tends to slow, knowledge tends to grow. All right, moving right along, I want to talk about cognitive development. Um, boy, I'm we're going to talk about this a lot more in the other classes that I recommended to you. So I'm going to zip through some of these ideas, but a big name in cognitive development in childhood is Piaget. And he has some interesting thoughts about schemas, assimilation, and accommodation. And the fact of the matter is, for Psych 1, I kind of wish I could teach them to you, but I'm going to say take another class. My metaphor for assimilation and accommodation, this might help you as you're reading about it in the text, is a closet. If it's assimilation, it means that there's already a shelf for it. There's already a place in your mind. So I can take this shoe and I can put it amongst the other shoes in my closet. I can take this parka and I can maybe I can stick it there, but I might need to create another section for heavy winter coats. But this hammer, I'm looking at my closet and there's no place to put a hammer. So I'm going to actually have to form another category or section in my closet. That would be accommodation. I need to accommodate this new information and find a new, adjust my schema to have a new category for, say, tools, right? So that's my little introduction to assimilation or accommodation. Here, another important idea that Piaget has is object permanence. And this is one of my favorite videos that I'm ever going to offer to you, but I can't show it to you now, but I'm going to give a link for you to watch it. You'll have fun watching this. It's so cruel. This guy is just messing with this little baby by putting a piece of cucumber under a coconut. It's too good to miss. Okay, so you'll watch that. Piaget is known for considering that there are distinct stages of development. So remember we talked about the debate of stages versus continuity. Piaget is associated with thinking that there's like a rapid onset of a new ability that happens, at roughly 2 years old, and another one that comes at roughly 7. And he's really, one of the things maybe I should have put here, he's really interested in understanding big changes in how children think. And the way that I think about Piaget is he hones in on the fact that little babies are all about their senses. They're sticking stuff in their mouth and they're banging it to see what sound it makes. They're touching, they're feeling, they're sensing. So all the way to age 2, it's all about sensing. Now, at age 2 to 7, they're beginning to form ideas about these things that they're sensing in their mind. So they're able to have abstract thought about a ball. And they're able to imagine that that ball actually rolled under the couch and didn't disappear forever. They can actually go and look under the couch for the ball that they saw 1 minute ago roll under the couch. Younger children actually don't have that ability. They're like, oh, gone. They're so busy sensing. So age 2 to 7, they're now, their words are coming online. Words are symbols for things and they're manipulating the words. After 7 is concrete operational. Now they're being able to use logic and analogy, and formal operational is, that's really using higher level thought, like forming hypothesis. If I do that and this is true, then this should happen, right? So he likes to think of children as becoming little scientists. So this formal operational after age 11, he likes to think, oh, now we're ready to become scientists. We can form hypotheses. We can do math problems. So Piaget is incredibly influential. Cognitive psychology, we're going to talk about it some more. It actually has moved on from this way of thinking that Piaget has influenced, but there's a lot that Piaget observed that was true. He didn't just observe it, he also did a lot of experiments to find these findings. So critiques of Piaget, um, we'll talk about that later. I want to mention Vygotsky because he's important in understanding cognitive development of children. One of his biggest ideas is the zone of proximal development. He focused less about the pure how do children think. That's what Piaget focused on. Vygotsky focused on how do children learn. And he really said children learn because adults teach them. That's Vygotsky. And he has this idea of the zone of proximal development, which is, here's a child, she's reaching up. If the child can grasp it without help, that's not the zone of proximate development. If the child can never grasp it, even if she gets help, that's not the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development is if she's reaching up, and an adult says, "Hey, let me help you," and then she can reach it. That's where an awful lot of learning takes place. This idea is very important in education. That's all I'm going to say about that. Because now I want to talk about socio-emotional development. I want you to know about Bowlby and Ainsworth's attachment theory. Attachment theory is very important for infants. It's kind of like the human version of imprinting. Attachment theory proposes that we evolved to be we need to be taken care of as little creatures. Little flailing babies, we can't feed ourselves. We can't protect ourselves. You leave a baby unattended, the baby will die. So that suggests that a lot of our behavior, for example, a baby crying or even a baby smiling, actually is a behavior that evolved to elicit behavior from parents. It elicits caretaking behavior from mothers and fathers who go, "Oh no!" Like the sound of a baby crying is incredibly painful to human beings. We need to do something to stop it. Now, hopefully, if we're well brought up and have control of our own emotions, the thing we do to stop it is to comfort and soothe. Some people might not have those skills and may whack the kid until the kid becomes basically dysfunctional. But attachment theory is an elaborate theory that you may be very interested in. I'm going to let you read about it. I'm going to let you read this slide. I'm going to ask you to watch this video, which basically shows you how people study the difference between secure attachment, anxious, which means I trust you, mom or dad. I trust that you'll be there to comfort me. And because I trust that you're there to comfort me, I'm more able to go out, explore my world, and take risks. That's the basis of attachment theory. What happens when people don't form secure attachments? They might form an anxious or ambivalent attachment, whereas the parent doesn't show any consistent response. So the child really needs mom's attention. Please, mommy. And they get so upset when they don't get it that they can't regulate themselves back down. And some of this is because they have uncertainty and insecurity about whether the mom is going to actually be there for the child. The avoidant attachment is when the baby has basically, the parent is neglectful and the baby is basically decided yeah, I'm not going to get what I need. So they don't even try. So they try to be independent. Now, some of this may be all about the parent. We're going to talk a little later about temperamental styles. It may be that there are aspects of the baby themselves that elicit these kinds of response, but it's a very powerful framework to investigate how your, sort of individual differences in your baby. And this disorganized is just that there's no form. I want you to watch this monkey video. I'm going to make it available to you. This is early investigations that really supported the idea that early caretaking, comfort, and soothing is more important than simply being fed. Like we as humans and primates have needs for being cared for that are possibly more, like, emotionally more important than simply being fed, like our drives. And you will see that when you see that Harlow's monkey experiments. Love this video. Parenting styles is another thing that we identify, because remember how I said in developmental psychology, we're really concerned about what causes what? And one of the things that we look at is parenting styles have a big influence on um, subsequent outcomes for children. So here are 4 parenting styles. Some are low in control and some are high in control. Some are low in warmth and some are high in warmth. And the best parenting style is authoritative. It's very hard to get this distinction between authoritative and authoritarian. Authoritative means I have rules for you. I want to know where you're going, but I also care about how you think, how you feel. Your experience is important to me, and I'm going to weigh who you are against my expectations for you and my need to control you. I'm going to have both of those things at the same time. That's the best parenting style according to the research and data. And I'm going to let you read more about that on that slide. So there's this concept of positive parenting that it's another thought that's out there about how to do parenting, in addition to these 4 parenting styles that we just discussed. Positive parenting is characterized by positive affect, like a tendency toward warm tones, smiles, and affectionate acts. Sensitivity, that I'm aware of and adjusting to my child's actions and wants. Doesn't mean that I'm just indulging my child. It means I'm adjusting. Child is upset with this loud music. Guess what? I'm going to turn it down. Because that's no harm. That doesn't hurt the child to have some of their needs met. In fact, it only helps the child to understand that some of their needs are valid and their concerns are important to their caretakers. That there's plenty of cognitive stimulation, that the parent tries to provide the child with interesting things, and that there's a sense of responsiveness. So, like, one of the big risks these days is of detachment or disengagement is when the parent's on the phone, parents doing the thing on the phone. Like for me, I have a habit of escaping my reality by doing some Candy Crush for a while. If I were doing that and my child was experiencing something that needed my attention and I just couldn't be drawn away, I'm giving a massive, massive message to that child that they don't matter. So positive parenting would be, yeah, I might do that phone, but after my child, I might do my Candy Crush, but after my child's asleep. That I'm actually here, I'm responsive to my child's needs. Moral development. We're going to again fly through this. You'll read in the chapter about Freud's psychosexual stages, and I can barely talk about this without derision. I hate this stuff. Let me tell you how I feel. It just bothers me that people really bought this for so long. I feel embarrassed for my whole field of psychology that this was taken as. Now, I believe that there are particular stages of development where people are sensitive to things, but I don't think it has to deal with whether I wipe, whether the anus, the genitals, etc. I just don't think it's that important. So, yeah. Anyway, so that's enough about that. Erikson is a name in moral development who I do want you to think about. I'd like you to spend some time with Erikson's ideas and let yourself think about what he proposed. Erikson's kind of awesome. Even though there's, like Freud, there's not there's only, well, Freud, there's like almost no empirical evidence for his theory. There's more empirical evidence for Erikson's psychosocial stages. But what I love about that is he proposed that people develop virtues at predictable stages facing these existential challenges. So, like questions like, can I trust the world? Is it okay to be me? Is it okay for me to move and act? These are huge questions. And Erikson proposed that at different ages, we're predisposed to answer different questions at different times in our lives. I'd really like you to think about what he has to say. Kohlberg is another name in moral development. For this is interesting and all, but what I want you to remember about Kohlberg is that he really focused on moral reasoning. He thought that there were stages in, like an order to the way, and a hierarchy of the way that we think about moral dilemmas. Like sometimes, like, yeah, that's all I'm going to say about Kohlberg. He really focused on moral reasoning. And why that's important is because he was very influential in sort of at his time, where people really focused on how people think. There was this focus on the thought process, and that we human beings were defined by our reasoning ability. But that whole focus has kind of gone by the wayside. It's not that that's not a big part of our definition of who we are, is how we think, but there's also other things. And so here's moral reasoning versus moral identity, like how we feel about ourselves. Moral identity is the degree to which your sense of self includes your moral principles. Who are you? I'm somebody who's kind to people. I'm somebody who's fair. That would be somebody with a moral identity. If you incorporate that into who you think you are, it predicts that you will actually engage in moral behavior. This perspective also places a bigger emphasis on empathy as a predictor of moral behavior. So, whew, personality development. And this is the last thing we're going to talk about. And these are the temperaments of children. So there's some really interesting stuff going on in this realm. And we just studied emotion, right? And we just talked about how there are different emotional styles. So the truth is, a lot of this temperament research doesn't necessarily characterize differences in temperament by the terms of their emotional reactivity, but newer research that looks at differences in children are really looking at emotional reactivity, impulsiveness, the bigness of emotion, or the type of emotion that's experienced as sort of characterizing these differences that children are born with, that we believe that they're born with. So, but in the old days, this Thomas and Chess, they were some of the first researchers to identify temperament. So you will encounter these classifications. So there are easy children who are happy most of the time, relaxed and agreeable. There were difficult children. These are children who are moody, easily frustrated, tensive, overreactive, right? And there are slow to warm up children, meaning children who are possibly more fearful. So some of, like, I'm going to give you what I think about these differences. I think that children are born with different emotional styles. And if somebody's responding to an emotionally intense child in a way that helps that child regulate their intense emotions and understand their intense emotions, then they may not actually be classified as difficult. But a child with intense emotionality that's being asked to repress their emotions, that's being confused about what even caused their emotions, they may actually develop what is understood to be this difficult reaction to the world. Similarly, the slow to warm up children might be more fearful. And if they aren't coaxed and soothed and brought into a sense of safety on a regular basis so they learn how to do that for themselves, they may stay always shy, always anxious, right? So I do think that there are these differences that people are born with. But here's a slide. Because we're out of time, what I just explained to you is this idea of differential susceptibility, meaning like if you're born with sort of a different processing style or emotional reactivity style, how you are parented can actually determine whether you're successful or not. So the goodness of fit, parenting that responds to the child that's there. Most parents with more than one child would say, my first child is different than my second child. But if they try to parent the different child, that the differences in the same way, one of those child is going to end up difficult. The idea is that you want to adjust to the child who shows up in your house, right? So here's another slide that you can look at to understand how, like, something like executive function, meaning how you think, is actually mediated by how they're taught to regulate their emotions. Okay, this is awesome. As you know, yet again, I love this topic. I hope you go on to learn more about it. Hope you download the slides and look at some of the details in more detail. And thanks again. We'll see you next time.